All right, welcome back to The Explainer tonight. The United Nations turns 80 this year in 2025. The origins of it, I will let my guest talk about in just a moment. But was made in a world that was completely different 80 years ago to where we are today. Is the UN still relevant in the world today, considering the crises, the situations, not just in Kenya, in Africa, but around the world? That's what we're here to talk about, the relevance of the UN at 80 in a modern world. And the UN resident coordinator, Dr. Stephen Jackson, joins me. Thank you very much for making time for us on The Explainer tonight.
Yvonne, thank you very much for having me on The Explainer.
All right. So before we begin, I know you wanted to say something about what's happening in Elgeyo Marakwet.
I was watching the really harrowing news footage of Elgeyo Marakwet. So first and foremost, from the UN, to send our heartfelt condolences to the friends and family of those who have lost their lives. And just to say, I mean, I'm proud to say we have a team from the World Health Organization, WHO, working very closely with the Ministry of Health, doing what we can, but a terrible situation.
It is indeed, and we hope for the best, especially as the search and recovery efforts continue.
Indeed.
Let's talk about UN turning 80. And I want to ask this, we have a varied audience, many of them young people.
Sure.
Talk to us about the origins of the United Nations 80 years ago, why it was formed, and what you believe the impact it has had in the world and in Kenya.
Yep. So I'm going to give you a yes, but answer.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of the United Nations. I think we should all be, because the UN is everybody. Yeah. It's 193 countries. It's everybody on the planet. But I do also think that the UN, like any organization at 80, it's got to look at itself pretty hard in the mirror, and it's got to do some changing. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. You're right to say that the world in which the UN was born was a very different one. It was the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. It was born out of the determination of those who'd fought in that war to say, we must never do this again, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That's what the UN Charter says. Over the course of 80 years, it has grown and changed and adapted and indeed reformed. But much of the DNA of the UN still is from that era. And as our Secretary General said memorably a year or so ago, you can't plan for the world of our grandchildren with an organization that was designed by our grandparents. So we do have to change. I think the impact has been huge and continues to be around the world. Let me just give you a few quick sort of numbers. Right now, globally, UN agencies are keeping alive about 150 million or more people affected by severe hunger, 150 million. By coincidence, it's about the same number, about 150 million or a little bit more, that we believe are the number of kids that have been saved by the vaccination programs that the UN supports around the world. And so I could go on multiplying those examples. There are 11 countries around the world where there are peacekeeping operations, 65,000 peacekeepers, many of them Kenyan, quite a number of them women, as we were discussing together at a meeting earlier today.
Yeah.
Kenya serving very proudly in Haiti, in Somalia and elsewhere. So I do think that the impact has been enormous and continues to be. But I also do think that, as I said, an organization that is 80 years old, you have to expect it to change.
Yeah. Let's talk about that change now. So obviously coming out of the Second World War, let's take a look at where the world is now. There's various flashpoints of conflict around the world, a very different state of play. And there's many who say, well, the UN isn't really relevant anymore. When the UN Secretary General speaks and says he's deeply concerned about crisis in Sudan, in Yemen, in Gaza, that it has little weight, and isn't a call to action for actors in that particular scene. Is it still relevant in the world today, and what would need to change?
I profoundly believe it is still relevant, and I do think that the UN regularly makes calls to action. What we don't possess, except in rare instances, is the power to compel. And that does go back to the origins of the UN. So the only power to compel that the United Nations as a family has is when the Security Council does it. And the Security Council is an artifact of the Second World War. So, as your viewers I'm sure know, it has 15 members, 10 of whom change and 5 of whom don't. And the 5 who don't have a veto. Yeah. And so only when the Security Council can reach unanimity is when we can compel. And even then it's pretty tough. At rock bottom, we are an organization of member states. That's our superpower, and it's also our weakness. Now, you said, and you were quite right, Yvonne, it was a different world back then. It was a world of a much smaller number of member states.
Yeah, for sure.
Kenya was still a colony, God help us.
Right.
And by the way, the UN has a very proud record of helping through the decolonization period. Not, by the way, completely finished. We have a much larger number of countries now, each with an equal voice, except when it comes to the Security Council.
Right.
But we also have civil society, which we didn't have before.
Right.
We have the internet, which we didn't have before. We have a massive youth population, which we didn't have before. And in all those ways, the UN, I think, needs to adapt and change and reform in a way that takes account of that new reality. And that's difficult to do because the DNA remains member states, it remains countries, it remains governments.
In an African context where the median age roughly in general on the continent is 19, how does an 80-year-old organization speak to young people in Kenya? I mean, you know, we've had a very active engagement from young people for years, but particularly and more so from 2024 to 2025. You know, what do you say to these young people who are agitating and who want change now and who want involvement and look to the UN and say, you know, but who are you in and how can we engage with an 80-year-old organization?
Well, even before we talk about what I might say, there's the question of how I should listen, right? Because I think we talk a lot about, oh, we must listen to youth. It's important that we listen to youth. There are 35 million young people in Kenya, and I often say if I listen to 35 million people, I will go deaf. Right. So what we've created, and it is an example, I hope, of how the UN is starting to change. We've worked with some very exciting Kenyan startups and civil society organizations to create a digital platform called ZK. Many of your viewers, I hope, have interacted with ZK. We've had tens of thousands of Gen Zs on it already. And that's a platform that allows young people to express themselves on public policy questions of the day, and to do it in a way that leads to, I think, concrete recommendations. That's just one example of, I think, how we're trying to adapt and change. But I do think the challenge for us, not just for the UN, for governments around the world, certainly for people of my generation, is to do a bit more listening and much less talking. Reforms at the UN, there's been quite a few calls for that. Kenya's President, Dr. William Ruto, made those calls for reform when he addressed the UN General Assembly about a month ago, and he reiterated those calls today in Doha, Qatar, where he's attending the Second World Summit for Social Development. And again today, he's calling for 2 permanent, 2 non-permanent seats on the UN Security Council with full rights and privileges. Is this a call that is, are you alive to this fact and these calls in the UN? And what are your thoughts around a reform agenda, and not just with the UN Security Council, but I'm sure there's wider reforms that are required across the entire global organization? Yes, so very alive to both. So let me talk about the call for reform to the Security Council, and then the broader call for reform. And by the way, Kenya is an extremely powerful and valued voice for that reform. So on Security Council reform, Secretary General of the UN has been very clear about this. He demands reform. It isn't just that Africa doesn't have a permanent seat on the Council, and there are other parts of the world that are similarly excluded. The problem is it's not in his gift to make that change. It's the member states. It's the only people that can reform the Security Council are the members of the Security Council, and there's the rub. But we're absolutely on on message with President Ruto, with the Kenyan people, and with others around the world who say that is a body that requires urgent reform. The broader reform, actually, if you're, I'm going to be probably accused of stumping for the president now, but if you haven't read what President Ruto's remarks were at the General Assembly just a few short weeks ago, it's a very, very interesting speech in which he says, on the one hand, the UN is not perfect and it needs to grow and change. And by the way, it has been growing and changing, and we can talk a bit more about that. But he said, be very careful. We need multilateralism. We mustn't kill it as we reform it, because we will never get it again. And this speaks to the very different world that we're in right now.
Right.
After the Second World War, there was a meeting of minds, and it was pretty rare and a pretty fleeting meeting of minds. And we would not get that meeting of minds in today's world. So if you do away with the UN, you're going to be without a multilateral instrument altogether. You're going to be without an instrument where the nations of the world can meet to a large extent on an equal footing, where they can come together to find collective solutions for the big problems that face us.
Is that still possible in the world today? There's a huge move to bilateralism, away from multilateralism. Strong leaders, strong-willed leaders who wake up and make a decision, some would say on a whim, and that could change the entire course of history, world economy, trade. How does the UN then become the force for multilateralism? And maybe multilateralism is gone.
This may be the only point in the evening, Yvonne, where I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I don't see a huge move away from multilateralism. What I see, and it embarrasses me, it saddens me, is actually a few countries, some of them very powerful, broadly speaking, in my part of the world, who used to be some of the loudest cheerleaders for multilateralism. They're the ones, I hope temporarily, turning their backs on multilateralism. But actually, everywhere else in the world, here on the African continent, in many parts of Asia, many parts of Latin America, and still in many parts of Europe, my country Ireland, you hear a very strong continued call for multilateralism. And why? Because the big problems of the day can only be solved multilaterally. Climate change. We can only do it if we can only solve it if we solve it together. The global resurgence of conflict, same story. Pandemics, COVID. We only were able to deal with COVID as we came together, right? And the cost of development. They're convenient. They all start with C, right? Climate, conflict, COVID, cost of development. They're easy to remember. Those are all things that are only susceptible to a planet-wide solution. Now, multilateralism is not only provided by the United Nations. It's provided by the African Union on the African continent. It's provided by the G20 for some of the rich countries. There's the BRICS. So there are new spaces where multilateral action is happening. But I still believe, as a matter of faith, that the UN remains very important. Is it perfect? No. And I'm not going to stand here and say that it's ever been perfect, because humanity is not perfect and the planet is not perfect, and the UN is a reflection of that. But I do think it's amongst the best things that we have, and so what we need to do is make it better and stronger and adapt it to a very different world in 2025 than we had in 1946.
Right, and part of that, the new changes is also in the issue of funding.
Yes.
The goodwill that existed around the world 80 years ago, after the Second World War, when the world said never again, that confidence, that funding, that support doesn't exist now. With the situation we've just talked about, with perhaps some of the bigger nations moving away from multilateralism, moving more towards the art of the deal, now withholding funding. Is this an issue, a concern within the UN? I would imagine also, we're seeing cutbacks on funding. What does that do to the role, the mandate, and the work that you do?
It's a deep concern. And first and foremost, it is a failure of global solidarity from the most wealthy. And that is, it's both an enormous source of damage. I also think it's an enormous source of moral shame. In terms of humanitarian need, the emergencies around the world, both natural disasters and conflicts, we've never had it worse, or rather, since 1946, since the end of the Second World War, we have the largest humanitarian need we've ever had, but humanitarian spending is taking a nosedive.
Yeah.
And that is a failure of global solidarity. And I think the world will live to regret that. And we are feeling it. We're feeling it hard here. To come to Kenya, so Kenya has, the benefit of not having been plunged into the kinds of broad conflict that have affected countries in the region, affected countries in the Middle East and so on. But even here, we had, because of climate change, between 2021 and 2023, we had the most severe drought that Kenya has known since records began.
Years, yes. Yeah.
6 million people affected at the height. Kenya government was looking after 3 million of those. The UN and international partners were looking after 3 million of those. If that drought reproduces itself tomorrow, I can't say with my hand on my heart that we're going to be in a position to look after 3 million people again, because we won't have the resources to do it.
And so how do we inspire, how do we lobby for some more funding? Most of development aid is now, most countries are now cutting back on development aid and going into defense spending. Naturally, with what we see around the world, what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, what's happening in Israel and Gaza. So what do we do?
If you go on a visit to the United Nations headquarters in New York, the other headquarters, as I call it, because this is a headquarters. This is a global headquarters.
It is indeed, yes.
We should be very proud in Kenya of the fact that this is one of the 4 global headquarters. But if you go to the one in New York, there's a clock that ticks up, telling you second by second how much is being spent on defense in the world. And I can tell you that clock, it was always going quickly, and it was trillions of dollars. Well, it's doing this now, right? Which is, again, is just appalling. I mean, as a planet, we should be ashamed of ourselves. This is the 21st century. We're supposed to be better than this. In terms of where that leaves us on the financing question, well, where do we turn? More and more of Kenya's development, because Kenya, there are deep pockets of poverty, there are deep pockets of hardship, and I know for Wananchi, it can be very hard day to day. Overall, Kenya has been on an upwards path, not as rapid and not as complete as I think everybody would want, but it's been an upward path. That means more and more of the development financing actually has to come from domestic resources. That means tax and then spend effectively, and then also from investment, right? So more and more of it is going to have to be lending, but lending that has to be on terms that the country can afford, and it isn't right now. But that's not the case for a country like Central African Republic or Burundi or some of the countries in the Middle East that are engulfed in conflict. There, you need aid. You need humanitarian aid, and it's not coming. And I'm really very worried about what awaits countries that are deep in conflict. I mean, we could just look to the northwest of us, I mean, in Sudan.
Right.
I mean, the appalling suffering.
Yeah.
And where's the response? And the UN can do very little if it's not given the means. And I am deeply worried by that.
Yeah. Does the UN respond, and I'm going to ask, this is a political question, does it respond adequately, fast enough to countries in the global south compared to those in the global north? Yeah.
I think it responds at the same speed, but is that response ever adequate? Never. And why? So if we look at humanitarian appeals, so if there's a conflict in country X or there's a drought in country Y, what do? We estimate the need and we put an appeal out there. No humanitarian appeal in the history of the United Nations, to my knowledge, has ever been 100% funded.
Yeah.
It's always underfunded. It has been the case that some conflicts closer to the north have got closer to 100%.
Yeah.
And I think that that's shameful.
Because there is a sense in which
one life,
Sudan, Yemen, and many other regions, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is right next door, feel ignored.
We do have situations, and I abhor it, where I talk to our donor partner countries, and they will say kind of apologetically, we're really sorry, there's no more money for...
Yeah. So is a
because
life in the Democratic Republic of Congo worth the same as a life elsewhere in the global north?
Yes.
To the UN?
And to the UN, yes. But to our partners, I sometimes wonder. It's a profound article of faith for me that every life matters. And that's why, and maybe I'm a bit partisan, I've spent most of my career working on this beautiful continent because I happen to think that African lives matter very, very much. And well, you can probably hear it. I should calm, but it makes me very angry that that isn't how the wealthy of the world always see it.
Yeah. I want us to talk about something else because now that we have you here, Stephen, you can help us with some understanding. There's been lots of talk about UN agencies that are coming to Nairobi. Like you rightly said, Nairobi is one of the 4, global headquarters. But it would seem that it would be more significant now that we have you here. I don't even want to mention them. Maybe you could help us dispel myths, rumors, and everything. These three, we understand, UN agencies that are coming to Nairobi. Are you going to confirm or deny? Are we going to do the confirm or deny?
We can do a bit of confirm and deny.
Okay,
yeah, but you carry on with your question and then I'll respond.
Right.
Yeah.
Tell us about these UN agencies that are coming to the country, because I think this is the moment we have the UN resident coordinator. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about these agencies that are coming, which ones, when they're coming, and then we can talk about some of the concerns that, and maybe hopes that Kenyans might have with respect to that.
So, first of all, as you've noted and I noted, this is one of the 4 global headquarters of the UN, and it has been for decades, very proudly. It is the only one in the global south. The other 3, New York, Vienna, Geneva, they're all in the industrial north. So Nairobi has always had a very particular importance, and if I haven't said it already, I should record our deep gratitude to Kenyans and Kenya for that, for making a home for multilateralism here. It has always been a global headquarters for what we call the UN Secretariat, and there are also 2 major agencies that have their headquarters, their global headquarters here. That's the UN Environment Programme and UN Habitat. That means that this is the capital of environmental and climate diplomacy in the world, and climate science. What we've started to see over the last couple of years is a slow but continuous movement of staff, capacity, expertise from a number of different specialized agencies, as we call them, of the United Nations, moving staff to Kenya. So the first myth I want to dispel is the notion that any agency that I could mention of the UN, and you know we have an alphabet soup of them, going all the way from the Food and Agriculture Organization all the way to the World Meteorological Organization. So it is not correct to say that any agency right now has taken the decision to move lock, stock and barrel in its totality to Nairobi. That's not happening. What we are having is particular teams or particular divisions or particular capacities in some of those agencies moving. So the first thing to say is it's happening. The second is it's been happening for a little bit. The third thing to say is it's not as big or as seismic right now as I think social media thinks it is, right? It is not thousands of people, it's hundreds. Okay.
And this is supposed to happen by 2026?
It's happening gradually, and it's happening on the calendar of each of those agencies. So some have already taken the decision to move, 100 people here. Some are still thinking about it. Some are looking at the global landscape and going, what is our budget going to look like? Can we afford to move? Can we afford not to move? So it's a little bit of a swirling situation, and I can understand therefore why there would be a bit of uncertainty.
So are they, you've talked about, so are they moving their headquarters? And just so we're clear, the 3 global UN offices that are here, making some movement here in a more substantive way, UNICEF, UNFPA and UN Women?
That's my understanding. I mean, if I sound like I'm evading it, it's because this is actually, that's not my job, right? I'm the UN for Kenya. So we could have somebody come on and give you the chapter and verse. But that is my understanding, that those agencies are bringing some capacity here I think UNFPA has already done so.
Right.
But as I say, it's measured in the hundreds, it's not the thousands, it's not the totality of the agency. UNFPA, for example, is still headquartered in New York. I'll go out on a limb. Do I exclude that in a decade from now that things might change and that might be a bigger move? I don't totally exclude it. What I think is happening, and I think it's very interesting, is that the UN, for the first 20 years of its existence through to the beginning of decolonization, well, it was largely an organization of the global north and to some extent the Latin American countries. Then we had the glorious moment where countries like Kenya were getting their independence in the 60s, and they begin to change the power balance in the UN. That process is continuing, and I do feel as though we're in a very strange moment globally. I think we are in a moment where if I can put it this way, the axis of multilateralism is tipping towards the south.
Is that why they're moving here, or there are other reasons?
That's one. Oh, sorry, go on.
Such as funding?
Funding is part of it, but I think it is also a reflection of that. This is where not only we're hearing, it's not only that we're hearing belief in multilateralism from Africa, but this is where multilateral solutions are being born. This is where the ideas are coming from. This is where a lot of the creativity is coming from. And I think it is an expression of that. The world's changing very fast. Personally, I expect the continent of Africa won't need this kind of aid for beyond another, 25 years, tops. Africa's rising very fast. I know we focus a lot on the doom and the gloom, but 12 of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world are on this continent. So it's also because of that the UN is bringing capacity here, because this is beginning to be where the global center of gravity is.
There is mixed, I think the news of this was met with mixed reaction.
Sure.
So there are some who say, well, this is good, there's going to be perhaps more money, more, dollars into the economy. And there's others who are thinking, okay, so let's put it bluntly, Stephen, not some more expatriates into Nairobi. They drive the prices of everything up. They live in their own little bubble and away from the rest of the Kenyan community. So just your comment on this mixed bag of reactions to the news that there could be, more UN presence in Kenya in the coming months.
So I plead guilty to a little bit of that. My wife and I chose not to live in the bubble. We don't live in Gigiri or Runda.
All right.
We wanted to live much closer to what we felt was the real Nairobi that we knew when we were volunteers here in the 1990s, and that we knew and loved. I understand why many of your viewers might feel like that. My first response would be to say, by far the largest number of people who work for the United Nations in Kenya are Kenyan. By far the largest number. And those are people working in the bit of the UN that I'm responsible for, which I call the UN in Kenya for Kenya, as opposed to the global headquarters, which is the UN in Kenya. They also work for that. There are very many Kenyans employed by the global headquarters here. And when we were talking before about staff moving here, what I really should have said was jobs moving here, because not everybody that had that job in New York will come here.
Okay.
It does prompt me to say one thing, public service announcement if I have time. We often get cases of poor Kenyans turning up at the gates going, I interviewed for a job and now I'm here to show up to work.
Yeah.
And we look and it was a scam. So what I would say to your viewers, please check, be very, very careful. If you're seeing lots of new jobs being advertised, that probably is a scam.
Right.
And when you know it's a scam? If you're ever asked for any money, ever, because we never ask for money for employment, ever. There's no application fee, nada.
Yeah.
So if somebody has said, just send me this on M-Pesa, you know it's a scam.
Okay, all right. I want us to close our discussion here, Stephen. So, as to where we go from here and where the UN goes, we know that there's some reforms that are being instituted by the Secretary General. Maybe you could talk to us about that. And like you say, and we understand that those decisions on the reforms will be made by the member states.
Yes.
But maybe you could speak to us about that push for reform within the United Nations and where we go from here as we close.
Okay. So, reform's already been happening.
Yeah.
I'm actually a child of reform, so my job was created for the first time as a full-time thing to try to oblige the different UN agencies to work together more effectively. That only happened in 2019. So that was the first phase of reform. But there's two very important elements of reform that I think the Secretary General, three, is identifying. One is cutting costs, right? So we have to make sure that every dollar, every shilling, every yen, every euro, every renminbi is used as effectively as it can. And there really is a strong efficiency drive there. The second is the number of what we call mandates. So what we mean is when the 193 member states in the General Assembly or the 15 member states in the Security Council say, UN, we want you to work on this. Do you know how many separate mandates we have? We tallied them up.
Right, yeah.
3,600. Oh. Ask any organization to do 3,600 things and you're probably asking for trouble.
And you're heavily bureaucratic.
Right.
That's what the UN is known for.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've got to reduce that.
Yeah.
Right. And this SG is calling for that. He called for it very clearly.
Okay.
But the keys to that lie with the member states. And then the third thing is the number of UN entities that we have, which is a little bit a function of that mandate thing, right? So in the United Nations country team, here in Kenya, there are 25 agencies, funds and programs. And those are just the ones here on the ground. Then there are ones also doing programming from elsewhere. Yeah. Please don't ask me. It'd be like asking, you know, a parent to choose amongst their children. Don't ask me which ones I would merge.
Right, yeah.
But I think we can all agree 25 is too many.
Okay.
And so that also is on the table. So we are talking, and the Secretary General is talking about merger, streamlining, efficiency, and getting back to what we're good at and leaving to others what we're less good at. And I'm all for that.
Well, that's a good place to leave it. Hopefully we see less bureaucracy and the UN gets to move faster and speak to the realities of the day and the youthful population, not just in Kenya, Africa, but also around the world, and continuing to be relevant. Like you say, there's room for multilateralism, and it's perhaps the only way we can get out of all the crises we face in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yvonne.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Stephen Jackson, who's the UN Resident Coordinator in Kenya, speaking about the United Nations turning 80 and its role and mandate in the world 8 years on, and perhaps in another 80 to come. Let's take a break. We'll be right back with more.